Transfer portal is in full swing. Transfer portal season is in full swing, I should say. All the portal entries are happening. All the players are going into the portal. Very few are coming out so far, but certainly we'll get to that point sooner rather than later. Remember, yesterday was the first day for undergrads to officially enter the transfer portal. Some guys announced last week or the week before that they were planning to go in, but yesterday it could actually officially happen. The transfer portal open for undergraduates and players whose coaches haven't left. I think if your coach leaves or you're a graduate, you're able to officially go into the portal sooner. That's why I think we saw some guys last week who have graduated, then they were able to go in officially. But yesterday was the first day for undergrads whose coaches haven't left to officially enter the transfer portal. And so we're certainly seeing those numbers. I think Pitt is closing in on a dozen or so of scholarship players who've gone into the transfer portal. And we'll take stock of that probably in a couple of days. Once it seems like the guys who are going to go are pretty much in, we'll take stock of what Pitt stands to lose to the transfer portal this offseason. But first, I think it's always important and valuable to have a little context on what Pitt lost last season, and to a certain extent, what Pitt gained last offseason from the transfer portal. And we're not going to make it a complete one-to-one, a grade. You ended up net positive, net negative, because I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. Some positions are more important than others. You may have upgraded or downgraded or stayed the same at long snapper. And that's significantly different than the changes you made or whether you upgraded, downgraded, or stayed the same at quarterback. One's going to have a lot more impact than the other. So I'm not going to make it a complete score sheet. Wow, Pitt won or Pitt lost, although it would certainly help with our SEO and engagement and clickbait if I said, did Pitt win the transfer portal in 2024? That's not exactly what we're going to do, but a little bit. We are going to look at what the guys who left Pitt did at their new schools this past season, and we'll inevitably compare it to the guys who came to Pitt and what they've done with the Panthers this year. So, off-season additions, how did Pitt do ultimately when we got to the end of the regular season? The players they lost and the players they added, how did Pitt do in the transfer portal? Let's talk about it here on the Tuesday. Transfer Tuesday. How about that? Let's call this the Transfer Tuesday edition of the Morning Pitt here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. Sometimes inspiration just strikes at the most random times. Now we have a new thing, Transfer Tuesday. We'll see if I remember by next Tuesday when we do next week's Morning Pitt on Tuesday. I guess that'll be the 17th. We'll see if the 17th and then the one on Christmas Eve, we'll see if that's a Transfer Tuesday edition of the Morning Pitt. But I just made that up. I like it. Maybe we'll make every Tuesday Transfer Tuesday. That's like 52 Tuesdays, right? Over the course of a year. Can I think of 52 things to say about transfers in 1 year? I think I can. We can highlight transfer of the week during the season. We obviously can extend it. It doesn't have to just be about football. It could be about basketball as well. And then we're going to have opportunity for transfer of the week through the basketball season. Guys they add, guys they lose. Transfer Tuesday. This is good stuff. I'm going to have to write that down. Transfer Tuesday. So for our first Transfer Tuesday, and possibly our last, we're going to look back at the players that Pitt lost to the transfer portal this past offseason and the players that the Panthers added. Now, in terms of sheer numbers, Pitt was -4. They lost 19 scholarship players to the transfer portal and they added 15. So, in terms of sheer numbers, -4. But, of course, it's a little bit deeper than that, a little bit more, I don't want to say complicated, but you need a little bit more context than that. Of the players Pitt lost, and I think we talked about these guys throughout the offseason, we kind of kept track on how they've been doing, and certainly we talked a lot when they left. Some of the most prominent, I think when you look at guys who went to, Power 5 schools, right? Power Conference schools. There's what, 6? 3 went to South Carolina, 2 went to Colorado, and 1 went to Texas A&M. Everyone else transferred down a division. So out of the 19 scholarship players who left Pitt for the transfer portal last year, only 6 ended up at Power 5 competition. And we won't entirely just cut it off and just ignore the other 13 because there were some guys who played well or started or had decent seasons out of those other 13. But when you look at the 6 who went to Power 5 competition, Power 4 competition, whatever we call it these days, you've got Sam Okunlola, who started 10 games, played all 12 for Colorado this season. You've got Deion Hayes, who only played 4 games due to injury, but he started 3 of those 4. You've got DeAndre Jules, who played the first 5 games, got hurt, and played the final 3 at South Carolina. And you've got Solomon DeShields at Texas A&M, played about 10 games, played about 16 snaps per game in 10 games, had about 19 tackles. Not a whole lot of production there. And then you've got Bengali Kamara, who went to South Carolina and played in 4 games before he requested a red shirt and a transfer. He's going to go finish his eligibility at Kansas. You have Buddy Mack, who went to South Carolina, I believe as a walk-on, played in 11 games, mostly on special teams. So out of the 6 guys who transferred, you really had the 6 guys who transferred to Power 4 teams. You really had 2 starters at their new teams, at their new schools. Sam Okunlola started 10 games. Deion Hayes started 3. Now, they both played games where they didn't start. But in terms of being starters, you really had those 2. Kamara wasn't a starter. He was mostly on special teams before he requested a transfer. Buddy Mack was all on special teams. DeAndre Jules, again, played 8 games and logged about 100 snaps, 130 snaps. Had 14 tackles and 3 pressures. That was about it. Solomon DeShields played 10 games, 160 snaps, 19 tackles, half a tackle for loss, half a sack, 4 quarterback pressures. Not a lot of production out of those guys. And even Hayes and Okunlola, who were starters and played a lot. I mean, Deion Hayes in 4 games had 16 tackles, 3.5 tackles for loss, 2 sacks. Pretty decent production for 2 games. Okunlola played 10 games, had 6.5 tackles for loss, 3 sacks, and 22 pressures. It was the 3rd most pressures on Colorado's defense. So I think, there's a couple ways to look at it with transfers and guys who leave. And, how much of a loss were they? Do you wish you had them back? Could they have helped? Whatever. Some of it, when you're evaluating how much of a loss they were or were not, some of it is going to depend on what your current roster situation was. Pitt needed defensive ends this year. I mean, I think they needed more of an impact off the edge because they just didn't have a lot of it. There wasn't a lot of consistent pressure coming from the defensive ends. There wasn't a lot of consistent pressure getting into the backfield. And so the front 4 wasn't generating pressure. Pitt had to blitz maybe a little more than they would have liked. And maybe that changed what their we know they're always aggressive. They're always going to blitz. But Pitt, like most teams, likes to be able to get pressure with 4 and rushing 4. And Pitt's defensive ends this year just really weren't up to the task of doing it consistently. Now, it's not like Hayes and Okunlola put up, Big 12 all conference numbers in what they did at Colorado. Again, Okunlola had 6.5 tackles for loss and 3 sacks in 12 games. Deion Hayes had 3.5 tackles for loss, 2 sacks in 4 games. Not bad, but not exactly, oh my God, that would have put Pitt over the top. Maybe it improves their depth at defensive end. Maybe those guys even start and play a lot and play well. But They would have helped because Pitt's depth was so questionable. They would have helped because Pitt's defensive ends were so questionable, but I don't think they would be a sure thing to make a major, massive improvement. And I said we weren't going to get too far into like the comparisons and this and that, but if you do compare numbers, Sam Okunlola, 12 games, 25 tackles, 6.5 tackles for loss, 3 sacks, 22 pressures. Nate Matlack, who came in and effectively replaced him, or at least was a swap. They lose one defensive end, they bring in another. Nate Matlack comes in, played 12 games at Pitt. He had fewer tackles than Okunlola. Okunlola had 25. Matlack had 19. Okunlola had 6.5 tackles for loss. Matlack had 6.5 tackles for loss. Okunlola had 3 sacks. Matlack had 5 sacks. Okunlola had 22 pressures, according to Pro Football Focus. Matlack had 32 pressures. So more tackles for Okunlola, same number of tackles for loss, more sacks for Matlack, and more pressures for Matlack. Now, that's not a one-to-one comparison. It's not exact like that, oh, Matlack was a better player than Okunlola, or it was better to have Matlack than Okunlola. Ideally, you could have brought in Matlack to fill out the defensive end depth and had him playing with Okunlola and Deion Hayes. I think that would have been Pitt's, if Pitt's 4-man defensive end rotation this year would have been Matlack, Jimmy Scott, let's say Okunlola or Hayes, and Sincere Edwards, I think you'd feel better about it than what they ended up with of Matlack, Scott, Edwards, and Chief Borders. because maybe you don't compare Okunlola to Matlack. Would Okunlola be an upgrade over Matlack? Maybe you compare him to Chief Borders, the number 4 defensive end, who definitely produced less. So maybe that's the more appropriate comparison to make. These guys would have helped, but it's not like they left and had huge seasons. And, Solomon DeShields may or may not have been in the starting lineup at Pitt this year. I think we can definitely say that Pitt was fine at linebacker this season. Kyle Lewis and Rasheem Biles getting All-America honors. Lewis, a first-team a first-team pick by the Associated Press. Biles, a second-team pick by the Associated Press. Those guys more than stepped in for what Solomon DeShields and Bengali Kamara did not do last season. They put up more than Kamara and DeShields ever have and ever did. And they were, maybe the best pair of outside linebackers at Pitt in a long time, exceeding what Kamara and DeShields did. And so, again, you don't make that one-to-one comparison. I mean, particularly not when Lewis and Biles were not transfers. But you can... when you look at what these guys did at their transfer destinations and compare it to what Pitt ended up with, you say, well, it was disappointing to lose experienced players like that, but if those guys cleared the way for Kyle Lewis and Rasheem Biles to play as much as they did, it wasn't necessarily the worst loss. So, you have those 6 guys out of the 19 transfers that ended up at Power 4 schools. 2 of them ended up as starters. Compare that to what Pitt brought in. Pitt brought in 15 transfers this offseason. 6 of them were legitimate starters. Desmond Reed, Nate Matlack, Raphael Williams, Nick James, Lyndon Cooper, and Eli Holstein. All significant starters. I don't need any adjective to modify that. They were starters all season long. They also brought in Tamon Lynham, who was the number 3 corner, Sincere Lee, who was the number 4 receiver, Jake Overman, who was the number 2 tight end, and Key Thompson, who was the number 2 middle linebacker. I would contend that all 4 of those guys, Lynham, Lee, Overman, and Thompson, had bigger roles than most of the guys that Pitt lost to other Power 4 schools. Now, when we get outside the Power 4, Carter Johnson was, the top tight end for Florida A&M. Christian Vare was a starting quarterback at Georgia State. He lost his job at one point, got back in due to injury. Israel Polk played a lot at receiver at Akron. Aiden Henningham and Stephon Hall played a lot at lower levels. Henningham went to Albany State in Georgia. Hall was an 11-game starter at Youngstown State. Byron Floyd went to Buffalo and snapped, So, there were guys who played significant roles at their new teams, but they largely transferred down. Out of the, this whole class of guys who did not transfer down, again, as we talk about the Power 4, it's Hayes and Okunlola are really the ones who had big roles. And so Pitt, I don't want to say Pitt added more starters than they lost, because Hayes and Okunlola were starters. Kamara, Jules, and DeShields were starters. Vare at one point was a starter. Carter Johnson was a backup. Who else? Byron Floyd, the long snapper, was a starter. They had a handful of guys who were starters who left, but they didn't exactly find those roles at their new schools, and Pitt went into the transfer portal and brought in 6 starters and 4 top rotation guys. And it's pretty remarkable when I say that number, because that's 10 out of the 15 players that Pitt brought in ended up being starters or top rotation guys. And that doesn't include Nile Upa, the long snapper, who is a starter. It doesn't include Chief Borders, who was a 2-deep defensive end, even though I don't think he's a top contributor, but he was a 2-deep defensive end. It doesn't include Anthony Johnson, who came in and got hurt in training camp apparently, and only played in the Youngstown State game, but he was a top reserve defensive tackle. You're really looking at these 15 guys they brought in just in year one. The only guys who really didn't make much of a contribution out of those 15 were 2 redshirt freshmen, David Ojebwe, the defensive end, and Jeremiah Anglin, the defensive back, and both of those guys went back into the portal. Otherwise, 13 out of 15 transfers that Pitt brought in this offseason all ended up as starters or top 2-deep players, top reserves who had, got significant playing time and contributed this year. And so that's probably the point I want to make. Rather than comparing what Pitt gained versus what Pitt lost, although I mean we could do that, I think it's almost just as interesting, if not more so, to look at what they added and the contributions that those players made. Because the 15 starters they brought in, or the 15 transfers they brought in, they got starters, like either guys stepped into starter roles, top reserve roles, or prominent 2-deep roles for 13 out of the 15, which I think is a remarkably high hit rate. Don't you? And it's not like this list of guys, they were all like bums that, well, you had to put them in there because there was nobody else to play. I mean, I thought Tamon Lynam was solid as a number 3 corner. I thought Sincere Lee was solid as a number 4 receiver. Desmond Reed was obviously really good. I think Eli Holstein is good. Raphael Williams, I think, was inconsistent but had his moments. Matlack, like I said, outperformed Okunlola, really. James, I thought, was solid. I think he'll be even better next year. They ditto for Lyndon Cooper. Key Thompson was a nice backup at middle linebacker. Jake Overman, I think, was more useful than I expected as a pass-catching tight end. You know, they did, I think, really well out of the portal last year. And I don't know if it'll be the same success rate this year. Actually, the transfer departures are going slower than I expected. I thought Pitt would be well over a dozen by this point, and as of this recording, they are not. And I'm a little bit surprised about that. So maybe they'll hold on to more guys than I thought. I still think there'll be a number who go in, and we get close to that 20 in terms of departures. But I think this is an impressive hit rate for the Pitt staff of guys that they brought in this past year, of the number of starters and top reserves and contributors that they were able to find out of the transfer portal. I think it's a good hit rate. We'll have a bigger breakdown today on Panther-Lair.com of the guys they brought in and what they did this year. But I think when you look at it name after name, you're like, wait, this guy played, this guy played, this guy played. And the only ones who really didn't, like I said, are Ojebwe and Anglin, 2 redshirt freshmen who went into the transfer portal. Again, they're going to leave. They're already gone. So I think that's worth keeping in mind as we see this staff add transfers this coming offseason. It's going to be, I think there's a little bit of a track record of having success there. So we'll see if they're able to duplicate it. We got Nate Yarnell popping up a little bit here in the photos. We still have the slideshow going from the Boston College game. It's worth noting that Nate Yarnell put himself into the transfer portal, announced it on Friday, I believe, so we didn't get a chance to talk about it here on the Morning Pitt. But Nate Yarnell was the consummate teammate, a guy who has he's done everything that's been asked of him. He's been asked multiple times to take a backup role, and he has done it. He's been asked in each of those occasions when he's been in a backup role, he's been asked to step in and play, and he's done it. 2022, he did it. 2023, he did it. In 2024, he did it. It's too bad he couldn't win a game as a starter this year, else he'd have a win in each of his seasons that he got a chance to start a game. He won that game at Western Michigan in 2022. He beat Boston College last year. Wasn't able to get a win this year. So I think he finished 2-3, I want to say, as a starter. 2 losses this year plus the Duke loss last season. He didn't have the mobility that Eli Holstein had, and that limited his playmaking ability in this offense in this season. But he was smart, good teammate, nice kid to talk to. Always very cordial and intelligent and insightful. So I always liked him from the interview perspective. But I certainly can't fault him for looking for an opportunity to play somewhere else. I think if you're Nate Yarnell and right now you're looking at the 2025 Pitt football roster, the best thing you're hoping for is an opportunity to go in if the starter gets hurt. And that's kind of the end of it. I'm not really sure that there was much more than that lurking out there for Nate Yarnell in 2025 with Eli Holstein, presumably coming back. And so it makes sense. Go off. He says he's got 2 years left to play, which I'm not entirely sure how he's got 2, but I'll take his word for it. He's a pretty smart guy. I don't think he would say that if he didn't believe it. But he's got 2 years left to play. I think transfer down a level, maybe look for somewhere closer to home. He's a Texas guy, so maybe find a smaller school, either a G5 school or even an FCS school in Texas, and go play. I think he's talented enough to play and have success and be pretty good at that level. It's unfortunate it didn't work out for him at Pitt, but he contributed to 2 wins over the last 3 years. So you shout out for that, right? Shout out for that. Oh, and he had the handoff for the game-winning touchdown against West Virginia. May not have many more opportunities to talk about that, so we should point it out now that Nate Yarnell had the handoff for the game-winning touchdown against West Virginia this year. He's got that going for him, which is nice. So good luck to Nate Yarnell and the rest of the guys who are leaving Pitt. Like I say, we'll take full stock of what they've lost to the transfer portal this offseason. Maybe we'll do that next Tuesday for Transfer Tuesday. Maybe that'll be next week's Transfer Tuesday conversation, is what has Pitt lost to the transfer portal. Right now, the number's sitting right around a dozen, maybe a little less, depending on if any more guys go in after we record this. But, we'll take a full stock of guys who have gone into the portal from Pitt maybe next week on Transfer Tuesday. For today, I just wanted to talk about Nate Yarnell a little bit, I should say, and give him his credit, because credit is due. All right, thanks for tuning in today. We'll get you ready for some Pitt basketball tomorrow. Panthers host whoever it is, Eastern Kentucky tomorrow night, one of their final 2 non-conference games of the regular season. And so we'll get you ready for that with some hoops talk and a lot more. So make sure you like this video and subscribe to youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. That way you never miss any of our Pitt video content. The Morning Pitt, our weekly live show. We'll get you, I think we're going to do that on Thursday, since we're not going to do it tomorrow night during the Pitt basketball game. We will do it on Thursday and talk about everything there. And, on our post-game shows, we'll have one after the Game Above Sports Bowl in the day after Christmas when Pitt plays Toledo. So we have that to look forward to, which is also nice. All right, like and subscribe. Make sure you check out Panther-Lair.com. Have a great Tuesday, and we'll catch up with you tomorrow for the Morning Pitt right here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com.